The silent inheritance. The text message arrived at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. That's how I found out my father had died. Dad passed last night. Funeral Friday. Please come. Diane. Diane was my father's second wife. The woman he left my mother for 20 years ago. The woman I hadn't spoken more than 10 words to since I was 14. Yet somehow, she was the one informing me that the man who'd walked out of my life was now permanently gone from it. I stared at my phone's blue light in the darkness of my apartment, waiting for some emotion to hit me. Grief, anger, relief. Nothing came. Just a hollow space where feelings should be, like a tooth newly pulled. Who's texting you at this hour? My girlfriend Mia mumbled from her side of the bed, her voice thick with sleep. No one important, I said, placing my phone face down on the nightstand. Go back to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come for me that night. Instead, I lay awake thinking about the last time I'd seen my father. 5 years ago at my grandmother's funeral. He'd aged considerably since the last time before that. His once jet black hair, now fully gray. His tall frame slightly stooped. We'd exchanged awkward pleasantries, careful to avoid any topic deeper than the unseasonably warm weather. He'd mentioned something about his business doing well, and I'd nodded politely, not bothering to tell him I'd just been promoted to senior editor at the magazine where I worked. Why would I? He hadn't earned the right to celebrate my accomplishments. When we parted, he'd squeezed my shoulder and said, "We should grab lunch sometime, Ellie. Catch up properly." I'd smiled tightly and said, "Sure." We both knew it would never happen, and now it never would. I didn't tell Mia about the text until morning. We were in our usual routine, her making coffee while I toasted bagels. When I casually mentioned that my father had died, her hand froze midway through pouring water into the coffee maker. What? When? How are you feeling about it? I shrugged, focusing intently on spreading cream cheese. Last night, apparently, and I don't know how I feel. Nothing, maybe. Mia set down the coffee pot and crossed the kitchen to wrap her arms around me from behind. At 5 feet 3 inches, she had to reach up to rest her chin on my shoulder. It's okay to feel nothing, or everything, or anything in between. Thanks, Dr. Phil, I said, but I leaned back into her embrace, grateful for the warmth. Are you going to the funeral? That was the question I'd been asking myself all night. I don't know. Probably not. What's the point? Closure, maybe? Mia suggested. I snorted. You need an open door before you can have closure. My dad and I never had that. Mia turned me around to face her, her brown eyes serious. Maybe this is your last chance to open that door then, even if just to close it properly. I hate it when she makes sense. The flight to Minnesota was turbulent, matching my mood. I hadn't been back to my hometown in 3 years, not since Mom relocated to Arizona for her health. The familiar landscape of Minneapolis-St. Paul looked alien through the airplane window, the sprawl of buildings and highways seeming both smaller and larger than I remembered. Mom had offered to fly up for moral support, but I'd declined. She and Dad had managed to reach a civil détente over the years, mainly for my benefit. But I knew attending her ex-husband's funeral would be uncomfortable for her. Besides, I was 34 years old. I could handle this on my own. Or so I told myself as I retrieved my rental car and punched my father's address into the GPS. The house where he'd lived with Diane was in Edina, an upscale suburb that had always felt worlds away from the modest St. Paul neighborhood where I'd grown up. I'd only been to their house a handful of times, usually for stilted holiday dinners in my teens before I put my foot down and refused to continue the charade of happy blended family. The GPS directed me through winding streets lined with large homes set back from the road behind manicured lawns. Spring was just beginning to touch Minnesota, the first crocuses pushing through the soil in carefully tended flower beds. Dad's house, I could never bring myself to think of it as Diane's too, was a sprawling Tudor-style home with a 3-car garage and a circular driveway already filled with cars. I parked on the street and sat for a moment, gathering my courage. You can do this, I muttered to myself. One day. That's all. As I approached the front door, it swung open before I could knock. A young woman with blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail stood there. Her eyes red-rimmed, but her makeup perfect. "You must be Eleanor," she said with a smile that seemed genuine. "I'm Jessica, Diane's daughter. We met once at your grandmother's funeral, but I doubt you remember." I didn't remember her at all, but I nodded anyway. "Thanks for having me. I'm sorry for your loss." The words felt wooden in my mouth. Jessica's smile faltered slightly. "Thank you. He was a wonderful stepfather. Please come in. Mom's in the living room with everyone." I followed her into a spacious foyer with high ceilings and a chandelier that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The house smelled of lilies and coffee, and something baking, banana bread maybe. The sounds of murmured conversations and occasional subdued laughter drifted from deeper in the house. "Can I get you anything?" Jessica asked. "Coffee? Water? Something stronger?" "Coffee would be great, thanks." She pointed toward a doorway to the right. "The living room's through there. I'll bring you a cup." I steeled myself and walked into a room filled with people, some sitting on sofas and armchairs, others standing in small clusters. My eyes immediately found Diane, perched on the edge of an armchair, nodding as an older woman spoke to her in hushed tones. She looked immaculate in a black dress, her auburn hair, now streaked with gray, swept into an elegant updo. At 62, she was still beautiful in that carefully maintained way of wealthy suburban women. She glanced up, caught my eye, and excused herself from her conversation. As she crossed the room toward me, I noticed she'd lost weight since I'd last seen her. Her cheekbones were more pronounced, giving her an almost gaunt appearance despite her perfect makeup. "Eleanor," she said, taking my hands in hers. Her skin felt paper-thin. "Thank you for coming. Your father would have been so pleased." I doubted that very much, but I squeezed her hands gently. "I'm sorry for your loss, Diane." "Thank you, dear." She released my hands and gestured around the room. So many people wanted to pay their respects. Richard was very loved. I nodded, unsure what to say. My father had been many things: successful businessman, enthusiastic golfer, occasional philanthropist. But in my experience, being loved hadn't been high on his list of priorities. Diane seemed to sense my discomfort. "There's someone you should meet," she said, placing a hand on my back to guide me across the room. "Richard's lawyer, Mr. Abernathy. He's handling the will." A balding man in an expensive suit stood by the fireplace, nursing a tumbler of amber liquid that definitely wasn't coffee. "Thomas," Diane called softly. "This is Eleanor, Richard's daughter." The lawyer's eyebrows rose slightly as he set down his drink to shake my hand. "Ms. Warner, I've been hoping to speak with you. If you have a moment tomorrow before the funeral, there are some matters we should discuss." I frowned, glancing at Diane, who had suddenly become very interested in straightening a stack of cocktail napkins. "What matters?" "Regarding your father's estate," Mr. Abernathy said. "Perhaps we could meet at my office. 9 o'clock. I guess." He handed me a business card from his breast pocket. "Excellent. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to speak with Richard's business partner." As he walked away, I turned to Diane. "Is there something I should know?" She patted my arm, her expression unreadable. "Thomas will explain everything tomorrow. Now, you should circulate a bit. There are many people here who've been asking about you." Before I could press her further, Jessica appeared with my coffee, and Diane drifted away to speak with another guest. I sipped the perfectly brewed coffee and surveyed the room, recognizing few faces. A man about my age caught my eye from across the room and began making his way toward me. With a jolt, I recognized him as Eric Patel, my father's godson and the son of his business partner. "Ellie Warner," he said, a smile lighting up his face. "It's been, 15 years?" "At least," I agreed, accepting his hug awkwardly. "Good to see you, Eric. How have you been?" "Can't complain. married with 2 kids and working for the family business. He gestured with his drink. The American dream, right? How about you? Still in New York? Still in New York, I confirmed. Working as an editor at Millennium magazine. Impressive. His smile seemed genuine. Your dad mentioned it when we had lunch a few months back. He was really proud. I nearly choked on my coffee. He was. Eric's expression turned puzzled. Of course. He always kept track of your career. Showed me your byline once. Said you were a better writer than anyone at The New Yorker. An uncomfortable heat crept up my neck. My father had never once mentioned being proud of me to my face. Not when I graduated with honors. Not when I landed my first journalism job. Not when I was promoted to editor. To hear he'd been bragging about me to others felt like a cruel joke. That's nice. I managed. I should probably say hello to some other people. It was good seeing you, Eric. I spent the next hour making small talk with strangers who seemed to know more about my life than they should. Each conversation adding to the disorienting feeling that I'd somehow wandered into an alternate universe where my father had been an entirely different person than the one I knew. By the time I made my excuses and escaped to my hotel room, my head was pounding. I kicked off my shoes and lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. What the hell, Dad? I whispered to the empty room. Who even were you? I pulled out my phone and called Mia. Hey. She answered on the second ring. How was it? Weird, I said. Really weird. Apparently my father was some kind of proud. Doting dad to everyone except, his actual daughter. Mia was quiet for a moment. People are complicated, Elle. Maybe he just didn't know how to show it to you. That's a cop-out and you know it, I said, more sharply than I intended. Sorry. It's just, I keep hearing about this man who kept photos of me on his desk and bragged about my articles and apparently talked about me all the time. And it's like, who is that? Because it sure as hell wasn't my father. I know, Mia said softly. It's not fair. And now his lawyer wants to meet with me tomorrow about the estate. I continued, making air quotes even though she couldn't see me. Which is bizarre because as far as I know, I was effectively disinherited years ago. Maybe he had a change of heart at the end. I laughed without humor. Deathbed redemption? Not his style. I sighed, suddenly exhausted. Anyway, how was your day? Tell me something normal. Mia obliged, filling me in on office gossip and her latest battle with our building super over the perpetually broken elevator. Her voice was a lifeline to my real life, the one that made sense, the one I'd built without my father's help or input. After we hung up, I lay in the darkness, trying to reconcile the father I knew, distant, judgmental, perpetually disappointed, with the man everyone at the gathering had described, generous, loving, proud. How could one person inhabit 2 such different realities? And why was I the only one who seemed to have experienced the former? The offices of Abernathy, Weiss and Mitchell occupied the 15th floor of a gleaming downtown Minneapolis tower. I arrived 10 minutes early, having barely slept, my mind racing with questions. The receptionist, a young man with impeccable posture, escorted me to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Mr. Abernathy will be with you shortly, he said. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water? Coffee, please, I said, wondering if I was going to be offered beverages everywhere I went for the duration of this trip. I was halfway through the cup when Thomas Abernathy entered, carrying a leather portfolio. He nodded in greeting and took a seat across from me. Thank you for coming, Ms. Warner, he said, opening his portfolio. I know this is a difficult time. Let's skip the platitudes, I said, setting down my cup. Why am I here? If he was offended by my directness, he didn't show it. Very well. I've been your father's attorney for over 30 years, and I'm the executor of his will. Before we get to the specifics, there's something he wanted you to have immediately. He reached into his portfolio and withdrew an envelope with my name written on it in my father's precise handwriting. I stared at it, making no move to take it. A letter? Yes. He instructed me to give this to you first, before discussing any other aspects of his estate. Reluctantly, I took the envelope. It felt substantial, several pages at least. Should I? I gestured vaguely. That's entirely up to you, Abernathy said. You can read it now, or later in private, but I will say that understanding its contents may help contextualize the rest of what I have to tell you. Curiosity won out. I broke the seal and pulled out several sheets of heavy stationery covered in my father's distinctive handwriting. The letter was dated 6 months earlier. Eleanor, if you're reading this, I've run out of time to say these things to your face, which is fitting given my track record of failures where you're concerned. I never was good at difficult conversations, something you no doubt learned early and well. I've spent decades convincing myself I did the right thing by keeping my distance after the divorce, that a clean break was kinder than the messiness of joint custody and weekend visits, that you were better off without the constant reminder of my new life. I told myself it was selfless, when in truth it was the opposite, pure cowardice. The truth, which has taken me far too long to admit even to myself, is that I was terrified of being the father you deserved. I convinced myself that financial support was enough, that making sure you and your mother were provided for absolved me of the harder work of actual parenting. I was wrong. You grew into an extraordinary person without my guidance, and part of me has always wondered if that was because of my absence rather than despite it. Your strength, your intelligence, your unwavering moral compass. These are qualities I've always admired from afar, even as I recognize there were traits that would make you justifiably unwilling to forgive my absence. I've followed your career with immense pride. I have a subscription to Millennium magazine in my name and another delivered to my office, just so I could have copies of every issue with your work. I've kept every article you've written, even the ones from your college newspaper that I had to special order from their archives. This probably sounds creepy rather than heartwarming, which is a fair assessment of our relationship. There are practical matters addressed in my will that Thomas will explain, but I wanted you to hear this directly from me. My greatest regret in life was not being the father you deserved, not because you needed me. You've proven beyond any doubt that you didn't, but because I missed the privilege of truly knowing my remarkable daughter. If you've read this far, thank you for that small grace. I don't expect or deserve your forgiveness, but I hope this letter might help you understand that my failure as a father was never a reflection of your worth, only of my own inadequacies. With love and profound regret, Dad. I stared at the signature. Dad. Not Richard, not father. Dad. A word I hadn't used in reference to him since I was 14 years old. Ms. Warner. Abernathy's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you all right? I folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. I'm fine, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Please continue. He nodded, pulling several documents from his portfolio. As I'm sure you're aware, your father was quite successful financially. What you may not know is that over the past 20 years, he established a trust in your name. A trust? I echoed, still distracted by the letter. Yes. Initially, it was funded with a modest sum, but your father made regular contributions, particularly after significant events in your life. Your college graduation, your first job, your promotion to editor. I frowned. How would he have known about those things? Abernathy looked uncomfortable for the first time. I believe he had someone keep him informed of major developments in your life. He had me investigated. The thought was both disturbing and strangely touching. Not in an intrusive way, Abernathy hastened to add. More, keeping track of your publicly available accomplishments. Right. I wasn't sure how to feel about that. So this trust? Yes. The current value is approximately $7 million. The number hung in the air between us. I laughed, certain I'd misheard. Excuse me. $7,412,000, to be precise, Abernathy said, sliding a statement across the table. As stipulated in your father's will, you now have full control over these funds. I stared at the statement, the numbers swimming before my eyes. This makes no sense. My father and I barely spoke for 20 years. Nevertheless, he was quite dedicated to ensuring your financial security, Abernathy said. There's more. Your father was the majority owner of Warner Patel Investments. His 60% share of the company is now divided according to his wishes. 20% goes to his wife Diane, 20% his business partner Vikram Patel, and 20% to you. I felt like I'd stepped into someone else's life. He's making me a partial owner of his company. I know nothing about finance. I'm a magazine editor. The day-to-day operations will continue to be managed by Mr. Patel and the executive team, Abernathy explained. But yes, you are now a significant stakeholder, entitled to proportional profits and voting rights on major company decisions. My mind raced. The company was worth tens of millions, if not more. This wasn't just financial security, it was generational wealth. Why? I asked, the question that had been building since I'd first walked into the house filled with strangers who seemed to know my father better than I did. Why would he do this? Abernathy's expression softened slightly. I can't speak to your father's motivations with certainty, Ms. Warner. But I've known Richard for 3 decades, and I observed that his difficulty expressing emotions often led him to communicate through actions rather than words. Perhaps this was his way of telling you something he couldn't say directly. I thought of the letter in my purse, the words my father had finally found when death was imminent. Too little, too late. And yet, more than I'd ever expected to receive from him. Is there anything else I should know? I asked. Abernathy hesitated. One more item, though it's somewhat unusual. Your father left you a key. He produced a small brass key from his portfolio. It opens his private study at the house. He specified that the room should remain untouched after his death until you had the opportunity to examine its contents privately. I took the key, turning it over in my palm. Did he say why? He did not elaborate, Abernathy said, only that it was important you see it for yourself. I returned to the house that afternoon, the key burning a hole in my pocket. The bustle of the previous day had been replaced by an eerie quiet. Diane answered the door herself, looking exhausted beneath her perfect makeup. Eleanor, she said, clearly surprised. The funeral isn't until tomorrow. I know. I hesitated, unsure how to explain my presence. Mr. Abernathy gave me this. I held up the key. He said it's to my father's study. Something flashed across Diane's face. Reluctance, perhaps, or resignation. I see. Of course you should. The study is upstairs, end of the hall on the right. I was just leaving for the funeral home to check on some details. Take all the time you need. She gathered her purse and keys, her movements precise but brittle, like a porcelain figure on the verge of cracking. At the door, she paused. He spent a lot of time in that room, especially these last few years. Sometimes I think he lived more in there than with me. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a deep weariness that made me wonder, for the first time, if Diane had suffered her own form of abandonment. I'm sorry, I said, the words inadequate but sincere. She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. We all make our choices, Eleanor, and then we live with them. After she left, I stood in the foyer for several minutes, gathering my courage. The house felt different without the crowd of mourners, more hollow, somehow, the silence amplifying its vastness. I climbed the curving staircase slowly, my hand trailing along the polished banister. The upstairs hallway was lined with framed photographs. I paused, examining them with growing disbelief. There I was in dozens of photos spanning my entire life. My kindergarten picture with missing front teeth, a middle school orchestra concert, me clutching a violin with solemn concentration, high school graduation, college commencement, photos I had no idea how he'd obtained, me at a literary award ceremony 3 years ago, accepting a plaque for a feature article I'd written, me outside the Millennium offices, caught mid-laugh, completely unaware of the camera. What the hell? I whispered, a chill running down my spine. It was like discovering I'd had a stalker all these years, except it was my own father. With shaking hands, I continued to the end of the hall. The door to the study was unassuming. Dark wood, no different from the others. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal a spacious room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large mahogany desk. But it was the walls that made me freeze in the doorway, my breath catching in my throat. Every available inch was covered with me. Framed articles I'd written, awards I'd won, pictures of me at various ages, handwritten notes in my father's precise script analyzing my work, praising turns of phrase or particularly insightful observations, a corkboard covered with clippings of any mention of my name in industry publications or acknowledgments in colleagues' work. In the center of it all, above the desk, was a large framed letter, my first rejection from Millennium magazine, alongside the acceptance letter that came a year later after I'd reapplied with more experience. Someone, presumably my father, had highlighted sentences from the latter. Your analytical voice and distinctive perspective set you apart from other candidates, and we are particularly impressed by your ability to illuminate complex social issues with both clarity and nuance. It was a shrine, not in a morbid sense, but in the way one might meticulously document and celebrate a passion. I was my father's passion, his secret obsession, hidden away in this room where no one, not even his wife, was permitted to fully enter. I sank into the desk chair, overwhelmed. The leather was worn in a way that suggested countless hours spent here. The desk surface was immaculate except for a leather-bound journal placed precisely in the center. I hesitated only briefly before opening it. The first entry was dated 20 years ago, shortly after the divorce. Eleanor started high school today. Martha said she wore the blue sweater I sent for her birthday, though she told her mother I should have known she prefers green now. She's right, I should have known. When did she stop loving blue? When did I stop paying attention to such details? The privilege of knowing these small evolutions is what I sacrificed when I left. I flipped forward several pages. Eleanor won first prize in the state essay contest. Her piece on environmental policy was published in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. She has her mother's gift for language and clarity of thought. I've arranged for a congratulatory bouquet to be sent from the family, though I doubt she'll imagine I had anything to do with it. Why would she? I haven't earned the right to share in her triumphs. And another, years later, Eleanor was rejected from Millennium today. The letter arrived at her Brooklyn apartment. I'd hoped, but first attempts rarely succeed in such competitive fields. I've made some inquiries about editorial assistant positions at smaller publications where she might build her portfolio. I won't intervene directly. She'd hate that. But perhaps a well-timed job listing forwarded by her college career center. Page after page, year after year, my entire life, observed from a distance by a man who, despite his absence, had never actually left, who had, in his own broken way, remained my father even when I'd stopped being his daughter. The final entry was dated just weeks before his death. The doctor gave me 6 months at most. Somehow, having a deadline makes everything both more urgent and more impossible. I drafted another letter to Eleanor today, explaining everything, then tore it up. What right do I have to disrupt her life now? To burden her with knowledge that can only hurt? Better to finish as I began, watching from afar, providing what silent support I can through the trust, and eventually the inheritance. Abernathy thinks I should tell her everything. Easy for him to say. He doesn't have to see the look in her eyes when she learns the truth. The truth. What truth? What could possibly be worse than the bizarre double life my father had apparently been living for 2 decades? I continued reading, flipping through the final pages of the journal until I reached the last entry, dated just 3 days before his death. I've instructed Abernathy to give Eleanor access to this room after I'm gone. Cowardly, perhaps, to make her piece together the story I couldn't tell her myself, but perhaps Kinder too. This way she can absorb it in privacy, without witnessing my shame. I've lived with this secret for so long that revealing it now feels like tearing off my own skin. But she deserves to know. If nothing else, I owe her that much. The key to the filing cabinet is taped beneath the center drawer of the desk. Everything is there: the original police reports, the letters, the evidence that was never submitted to the court. Enough for her to understand why I left, why I stayed away, why I couldn't be the father she needed even though I desperately wanted to be. I hope someday she might find it in her heart, if not to forgive me, then at least to understand that everything I did, including leaving, was out of love for her. A poor substitute for actually being there, I know, but it was the best I could manage with the impossible choice I faced. If there's any mercy in this world, she'll never have to make such a choice herself. My hands were shaking as I reached under the desk, feeling along the smooth wood until my fingers found a small metal key taped to the underside of the center drawer. The filing cabinet stood in the corner of the room, an unassuming gray metal box that suddenly seemed ominous. The key turned with a metallic click, and the top drawer slid open smoothly. Inside was a single thick file folder labeled simply, Eleanor, the Truth. I lifted it out and returned to the desk, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. For a moment, I considered stopping, closing the folder, locking the room, walking away with the inheritance, and without this knowledge that my father had simultaneously wanted me to have and dreaded sharing. But I'd come too far to turn back now. I opened the folder. The first document was a police report dated 22 years ago, when I was 12 years old. The victim's name had been redacted, but the suspect was clearly listed: Victor Harrington, my mother's brother, my beloved Uncle Vic. I scanned the report with growing horror. Sexual assault, multiple incidents, victim under the age of 14. Beneath it was a handwritten statement in an achingly familiar childish script, my own handwriting from 7th grade, describing in horrific detail what my uncle had done to me on 3 separate occasions when he'd stayed with us during his divorce. A statement I had no memory of ever making. My hands now trembling violently, I continued through the documents. Medical reports confirming evidence of abuse, photographs of bruises, a psychiatric evaluation stating that the victim was suffering from acute traumatic stress and beginning to show signs of memory repression, a protective mechanism to shield the developing brain from unbearable trauma, and then a letter from the district attorney to my father. Mr. Warner, after careful consideration of the evidence and the extreme vulnerability of the victim as a witness, we have determined that proceeding with charges against Victor Harrington would not be in the best interest of the child. The defense attorney has already indicated their intent to aggressively cross-examine the victim, and our psychiatric experts believe this could cause profound additional trauma and potentially permanent psychological damage. We understand this is not the outcome you had hoped for, but we must prioritize your daughter's well-being over the uncertain prospect of conviction. We recommend continuing with the therapy already initiated and focusing on healing rather than legal justice at this time. Sincerely, Margaret Chun, Assistant District Attorney. Attached was my father's furious response, demanding they reconsider, offering to hire private attorneys, threatening to go to the media, and the final, devastating reply from the DA's office. Mr. Warner, your frustration is understandable, but our decision stands. I must caution you that pursuing this matter through alternative legal channels or the media would almost certainly result in public identification of your daughter as a victim of sexual assault. Despite best efforts to maintain her privacy, the defense would have significant latitude to investigate her personal life and character in ways that would be deeply traumatizing. Furthermore, our psychiatric consult has advised that your daughter's memory repression appears to be deepening. Dr. Levinson believes she is subconsciously blocking these events as a survival mechanism, and that forcing her to repeatedly recount them, as would be necessary for any legal proceeding, could potentially cause severe and lasting psychological harm. I strongly urge you to consult with Dr. Levinson about how to proceed in a way that prioritizes your daughter's psychological healing over the understandable desire for justice. Margaret Chun, Assistant District Attorney. The next document made my blood run cold. A printout of an email from my uncle to my father, dated just weeks before my parents' divorce was announced. Richard, I understand your concern, but I think we both know pursuing this any further would devastate this family. Martha's barely holding it together as it is. And can you imagine what this would do to Eleanor if it became public? Kids are cruel, and this would follow her forever. I'm getting help, real help this time. The program in Arizona is exactly what I need, and I've already made arrangements to relocate there permanently. I'll be out of Eleanor's life completely. No holidays, no family gatherings, nothing. She'll never have to see me again. All I'm asking is that you let this go. For Eleanor's sake. She doesn't remember what happened, according to the doctors. Let her keep that blessing of forgetting. Why force her to relive something her mind has already decided to protect her from? If you push this, it won't just be me who suffers. It will be Eleanor who pays the highest price. Is that really what you want? Consider carefully, brother-in-law. Some paths, once taken, can never be undone. Victor. My father's reply was brief. Stay away from my daughter or I will kill you myself. That's not a threat, it's a promise. As for what happens next, I'll do whatever causes Eleanor the least harm. Nothing else matters. The final document in the file was a letter from Dr. Sarah Levinson, child psychologist, dated 1 week before my parents announced their divorce. Dear Mr. Warner, after our consultation yesterday, I've given considerable thought to the impossible situation you're facing. While I cannot and would not presume to tell you what decision to make regarding your marriage, I do feel professionally obligated to share my clinical assessment of the options as they relate to Eleanor's psychological well-being. The complete memory repression Eleanor has developed is, while concerning, actually a sophisticated coping mechanism that is allowing her to function normally in her day-to-day life. Her mind has created a protective barrier between her conscious awareness and the traumatic events, effectively allowing her to continue her development without the burden of that trauma. There are 2 potential paths forward. 1. Therapeutic intervention aimed at helping her process these memories. This would mean deliberately bringing the traumatic events back into her conscious awareness through specialized therapy. While this approach has merits for long-term healing, it carries significant risks of re-traumatization, especially given the lack of legal resolution and the continued presence of the perpetrator within the extended family structure. 2. Allowing the memory repression to remain intact while ensuring her safety through other means. This would require completely removing the perpetrator from her life and creating an environment where she never needs to encounter him again. It would also require vigilant attention to any signs that memories are beginning to surface naturally, at which point immediate therapeutic intervention would be necessary. I'll continue the story directly from where it left off. Asterisk, you've expressed concern that remaining in your marriage would make option 2 impossible, as your wife is unwilling to completely cut ties with her brother, despite the evidence you've presented. Her emotional response, denial, minimization, and anger directed at the messenger rather than the perpetrator, while deeply troubling, is unfortunately not uncommon in these situations. Family systems often resist acknowledging abuse, particularly when perpetrated by a member of that system. If you choose to end your marriage as a means of protecting Eleanor, I must caution you that explaining your true reasons to her could potentially break through her memory repression prematurely and without proper therapeutic support. You would, in essence, be forced to choose between allowing her to believe you abandoned the family without cause, likely causing significant but manageable attachment issues, or risking a traumatic memory breakthrough that could have profound psychological consequences. There are no good options here, Mr. Warner. Only painful choices made out of love. Whatever path you choose, I am available to provide ongoing support for Eleanor's mental health needs. With deepest sympathy, Dr. Sarah Levinson, PhD, Child and Adolescent Psychology *. I set the letter down with trembling hands, a strange buzzing filling my ears. The world around me seemed to waver, as if the solid foundation of my life My memories, my understanding of my own history, was suddenly revealed to be nothing but a mirage. Uncle Vic, my mother's charming, funny brother who'd visited a few times when I was in elementary and middle school. I had vague memories of him staying with us briefly during his divorce, bringing me books and taking me for ice cream. He'd moved to Arizona when I was 12, and I'd never seen him again. My mother had visited him occasionally, but he'd never returned to Minnesota. I'd always thought my father disliked him because he was irresponsible with money, always asking for loans. That's what Mom had said anyway. My stomach lurched, and I barely made it to the small bathroom attached to the study before I was violently ill. Afterward, I slumped against the cool tile wall, my mind racing. My father hadn't abandoned me. He'd left to protect me, making the only choice he felt he could, sacrificing his relationship with me to ensure I never had to face my uncle again, to ensure my mother couldn't facilitate family healing that would put me in harm's way. He'd chosen to be the villain in my story rather than force me to remember what had actually happened. And my mother, had she really chosen her brother over my safety? Or had she, as Dr. Levinson suggested, been unable to accept the truth about her brother? Either way, the betrayal cut deep. I don't know how long I sat there on the bathroom floor, but eventually I dragged myself back to the desk. I carefully replaced all the documents in the folder, returned it to the filing cabinet, and locked it. Then I sat back in my father's chair, surrounded by the evidence of his decades-long vigil, his silent guardianship. My phone buzzed with a text from Mia. "How are you doing? Worried about you." How was I doing? I had no idea how to answer that. My entire life narrative had just been completely rewritten. The father I'd resented for 20 years had sacrificed everything, including my love, to protect me from both my abuser and from my own memories. I typed back, still processing, "Call you tonight." Rising on unsteady legs, I took one last look around the study, at the careful documentation of my life, the evidence of a love so profound it had chosen my well-being over its own expression, a love that had been content to watch from a distance, asking nothing in return except the knowledge that I was safe and thriving. As I locked the study door behind me, I realized I was crying. Not the explosive sobs I might have expected, but silent tears sliding down my face in a steady stream. Grief for the father I'd never really known, for the relationship we might have had in another world with different choices. Grief for the young girl I'd been, protected from her own history by her father's sacrifice and her mind's defense mechanisms. I made my way back downstairs just as Diane returned, looking exhausted. "Eleanor," she said, her voice tentative, "did you find what you were looking for?" I studied her face, wondering how much she knew. "Did he tell you? About why he left my mother? About why he stayed away from me?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Not at first. We'd been married nearly 5 years when he finally told me. He worried constantly about you, Eleanor. Every time your mother mentioned her brother might be visiting, Richard would find a way to make sure you were away at camp or staying with friends. He had a private investigator make sure your uncle remained in Arizona. He lived in fear that someday you'd remember, and he wouldn't be there to help you through it. Why didn't he fight for custody?" The question that had haunted me for years. "The lawyers advised against it," she said, her voice gentle. A custody battle would have meant psychological evaluations, possibly bringing up the abuse allegations. They told him the best thing for your mental health was stability with your mother and complete separation from your uncle, which he could ensure better from a distance than by fighting a legal battle that might trigger your memories before you were ready to handle them. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "He wanted to tell you the truth so many times," Diane continued, "especially after you were an adult. But the therapists he consulted warned that artificially triggering repressed memories could be devastating. They advised letting your mind reveal them naturally, if ever. He lived in fear of causing you more harm." "And my mother, did she really choose her brother over me?" The question hurt to ask. Diane hesitated. "Richard believed your mother was in denial, that she couldn't accept what her brother had done. In fairness to her, she never allowed him back in your home, even though she maintained contact. Your father felt it wasn't enough, that any contact was too much risk. She sighed. Perhaps they were both doing what they thought was best for you in their own ways. I wasn't ready to be so charitable toward my mother, but that was a reckoning for another day. The funeral is tomorrow, I said, suddenly remembering the reason I was in Minnesota in the first place. Yes, Diane replied, though perhaps it won't be quite what you expected now. No, it certainly wouldn't be. I would be burying a man I'd never really known. Not the father who'd abandoned me, but the father who'd sacrificed everything to protect me. I should go, I said. I need some time to process all of this. Diane nodded. Of course. But Eleanor, if I may, Richard loved you more than anything in this world. Every decision he made, right or wrong, came from that love. I nodded, unable to speak, and made my way to the door. As I reached for the handle, Diane called after me softly. There's one more thing. In the hospital, at the end, your name was the last word he spoke. The cemetery was peaceful, morning sunlight filtering through the trees as the minister spoke of a man he clearly hadn't known well, offering generic platitudes about a dedicated businessman and loving husband and father. I sat in the front row beside Diane, acutely aware of the curious glances from the gathered mourners, colleagues and friends who knew the story of Richard Warner's estranged daughter suddenly included in his will. I wondered what rumors circulated among them, what theories they had about the mysterious inheritance. None of them could possibly guess the truth. My phone buzzed in my purse, a text from my mother. Thinking of you today. Call me after if you want to talk. I put the phone away, without responding. That conversation would happen, but not today. Today was for my father. When the service concluded and the mourners began dispersing toward their cars, I remained seated, staring at the polished mahogany coffin that would soon be lowered into the ground. Would you like a moment alone? Diane asked softly. I nodded, grateful for her perception. After everyone had moved to a respectful distance, I approached the coffin and placed my hand on its smooth surface. I didn't know you, I said quietly. And you didn't really know me. Not the way a father should know his daughter. But I understand now. I understand, Dad. The word fell foreign in my mouth, yet somehow right. He had been my dad, in the most fundamental way, protecting me at any cost, even the cost of our relationship. I don't know what happens now, I continued. I don't know if these memories will eventually surface, or what I'll do if they do. But I know this, the trust you built, the company's shares, they're not just money to me. They're proof that you never actually left, not completely. You were watching over me all along. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of peace despite the turmoil of emotions. I forgive you, I whispered, for the only thing you actually needed forgiveness for. Not finding another way, not fighting harder to stay in my life. Everything else, there's nothing to forgive. You did the best you could with an impossible choice. I placed the white rose I'd been holding atop the coffin. Goodbye, Dad. 6 months later, I stood in the doorway of what had once been my father's study, now transformed. The shrine-like quality was gone. The obsessive documentation of my life replaced with a more balanced representation. Select photos and mementos shared with framed pictures of my father, Diane, and me from the few occasions we'd been together. The room had become a bridge rather than a memorial, connecting the past to the present and, perhaps, the future. Are you sure about this? Mia asked, coming to stand beside me. We can still back out. The magazine would take you back in a heartbeat. I smiled, leaning into her familiar warmth. I'm sure. Some inheritances are more than money. In the months since my father's funeral, my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined. I'd resigned from Millennium to focus on establishing a foundation in my father's name, the Warner Foundation for Child Protection, dedicated to supporting therapeutic services for children who had experienced abuse. I'd had difficult conversations with my mother, confronting her with the evidence my father had preserved. Her denial had finally crumbled in the face of the documentation, leading to her own painful reckoning and, eventually, a severing of her relationship with her brother. We were working on rebuilding our relationship, though trust came slowly. I'd begun therapy with a specialist in repressed trauma, not to force the memories to surface, but to prepare myself should they ever return naturally. The foundation work occasionally triggered anxiety and unexplained panic attacks, suggesting my mind was perhaps beginning to probe at the edges of those locked memories. But I was facing that possibility with professional support and Mia's unwavering presence. The first grant recipients will be announced next week, I told Mia, turning away from the study. 10 organizations across the country providing trauma-informed therapy for children. Your father would be proud, she said, squeezing my hand. I think he would be. I smiled. It's strange, I spent so many years angry at him for his absence, never knowing he was present in all the ways that truly mattered. His was a silent inheritance, but in the end, perhaps the most valuable one he could have given me. We walked downstairs to where Diane was waiting with tea. She visited New York regularly now, slowly building the relationship with me that my father had always hoped would someday be possible. None of us could change the past. Not the abuse I couldn't remember, not my father's impossible choice, not the 20 years of estrangement. But we were creating something new from the ashes of those old sorrows, transforming my father's silent guardianship into a vocal advocacy that might spare other children similar pain. It wasn't the life I'd imagined 6 months ago, but it was the one my father had made possible through his final gift. Not the money or the shares, but the truth. The knowledge that even in absence, love can be profound and enduring, that some inheritances are passed along not in what is said, but in what is done, not in presence, but in sacrifice. The silent inheritance that, in the end, spoke volumes. The end. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible content.